My name is Joe Whitchurch, and I'm the acting AMD for Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and the regional ministry director for East Ratio Christi, and I'm doing a book, Political Theory and the Social Justice Movement by Dr. Neil Shenvi and Dr. Pat. Summary plus some context for how to use it on campus. So let me start with his introduction. And he gives 3 examples of random statements, one by Rosie O'Donnell, saying concerning candidates for political office, quote, "No more old white men." And then he quotes another source after the Pulse nightclub shootings in Orlando, saying that the threats are not from Islamic extremists, but from white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, and militarism. And the third quote is from Progress in Human Geography, which blames melting glaciers on patriarchy and relates it to a feminist connection, causal. And then he asked the question, what do these 3 statements have in common? And he says, well, it could just be we have a vague sense that it's politically correct, going off the hooks, or it's some 21st century progressive zeitgeist and otherwise unconnected. But he said, no, another thing we could say is it's utterly nonsensical how we might relate to that. And it actually does have a connection. The connection is in a knowledge area known as critical theory, which seeks to understand human relationships through the fundamental lens of power, the exclusive fundamental lens of power. And he talks about contemporary critical theory that divides the world into oppressed groups and their oppressors along lines of race, class, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, physical ability, age, weight, and a host of other identity markers. And their goal is to work for the liberation of oppressed groups and deconstruct hegemonic narratives. These are the people of power and how they use reason and story to justify their keeping a hold of power. And these things need to be deconstructed. And he says that the Pulse tweet, the feminist glaciology, and the statement by Rosie are rooted in the basic tenets of the ideology of contemporary critical theory. So basically in this introduction, it's pretty useful, actually. He says the 3 things he's going to do in the booklet, and actually he does the foundational premises of racism and racial injustice to the people who learn it, both an emotional appeal and a historical appeal. Secondly, he wants to talk about critical theory as how it's deeply antithetical or contradictory in many ways to major biblical doctrines and worldview statements that are Christian. And thirdly, he wants to talk about how to share the gospel with people who have been exposed to it or hold to it or devotees to it, and how have wisdom and tact in holding every thought captive to the glory of Christ and helping us to be better witnesses. I appreciate that introduction. I took a little extra time with it because I think it actually is also a good summary of the book. So when he talks about the history of critical theory, I'm showing you the booklet on the history title here. He talks about, of course, the Frankfurt School in Germany and how the Marxists there, many of them Jewish, were upset with the fact that communism was not advancing quickly enough in Western Europe. And they were being resisted by the National Socialist these people who were worldview, like Marcuse and others. They had to exit Germany and the Frankfurt School, and came here. One of the big shots there is a guy named Herbert Marcuse, and he has a big emphasis on sexual liberation, which isn't really liberating according to Christian worldview. It's actually ensnaring. But he also says, and I think this is good counsel, to when you're in a debate or even a mild conversation with somebody who holds to critical theory, to not jump to the, he calls it, well-poisoning descriptor of Marxism, because people will respond to that. I think they're also responding today to even saying critical theory, even though that is the scholarly title for it. I've heard people and seen people say on Facebook, oh, you're talking about the big bad boogeyman of critical theory. And actually, I'm not sure it's the boogeyman, but it is critical theory, critical race theory, critical queer theory, critical economic theory, and these things are very much in vogue today. And he talks about in that historical section some of the more modern folks who are advocates of such, like Robin DiAngelo.
Things are very much in vogue.
I guess my phone wanted to pick up on what I was saying, wanted to start talking to me for some reason. He talks about Robert DiAngelo, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Ibram Kendi, are three widely read people, White Guilt and so forth, the devotees to this theory. Then he talks about the contemporary theory. He talks about some of the issues here are related to dividing the world into two classes of people, oppressors and the oppressed. And part of the challenge, of course, as Christians is we don't believe in oppression either, but we define it different according to the dictionary to be the unjust or cruel exercise of authority and power, whereas according to the modern critical theory definition, it's the hegemonic stories that we tell each other that reinforce the norms of society that may or may not have cruel or oppressive intentions. It's just the assumptions that people have that are part of oppression. We'll talk about that a little bit more in this summary. But so, in relationship between groups, it's oppressor and oppressors, and it's men versus women, able dominant groups set the norm, and contemporary theory is seeking to unmask that contemporary critical theory. So part of the categories are the theorists are racism, sexism, classism, ableism, capitalism, heteronormity, cisgender privilege as the forms of the oppressor. For people in understanding certain terms, like when you're called a white supremacist, they're not actually saying that you're a person that has lynched people. They're saying power structure that doesn't even recognize the power that you have, kind of like people who are monocultural and have never been anywhere that people didn't speak English, never been outside of rural exercise power on that basis, and they view that as oppression. And that's interesting. There may be some value to understanding that. In terms of contemporary critical theory, this is on page 6, there's an emphasis on liberation. And one of the things that's very important for getting rid of these neo-colonial thing like criminal justice reform or reform of the police or reform in economics, then the people of power and the oppressors will in a total social, and that's where it gets rather revolutionary and somewhat deterministic, and also a little that anything that would seek to reason contrary is just evidence of the fact that you're one of the peoples that holds the power. So for Christians, this is going to be an issue, areas of people being created in the image of God. We're being universally fallen in sin. Issues not just of morality versus the oppressed group is immoral, and the oppressor. But in other areas, like for instance, they will talk about issues of power, but rarely will they talk about things like the Ten Commandments or virtues like honesty, kindness, chastity, patience, and forgiveness, or fidelity, modesty, or even civility. In fact, in critical theory, when it gets into the revolutionary mode, the end justifies the means, so it doesn't really matter if you're honest or civil. The ends justify the means. One of the things he says, there's the whole area of epistemology. You see that on my outline of access to issues. Again, is that knowing truth by reason be accused of being a Western white male construct. White who have studied philosophy, but it's seen as part of that structure. And what's important, what of moral authority or of more power is your lived experience. So if your lived experience is one of experiencing oppression, then you should be given extra status and power versus just a vying to hold on to your power. So he talks about whites produce and reinforce dominant narratives such as individualism, and certainly in the United States we have a lot of individualism, and meritocracy. They hold a Protestant work ethic. If you work hard, you get ahead. And some people who work more in community and value family, and the family moves in with them when they get ahead and haven't had as many opportunities in work, they resent some of these things. And so there's a perception of power. It's multiplied, he says in verse 8, by the concept of intersectionality. So you may be a oppressed minority in terms of being a white female, but you're still dominantly an oppressor because you are Caucasian. But there could be different areas where you may be a minority race. You may not cisgender. In other words, you may are having power over you, and national religions having higher status. If you're oppressed in more than one of these groups, and you have the intersectionality thing going for, and you're agreeing to more truth and to more avenues for knowing truth because you're experiencing this oppression. So some of the positives of critical theory, and I appreciated that he said that. He actually, I think I reinvented the word positive in my outline here. Overlapping good things between contemporary critical theory and Christianity is that there seems to be some recognition that oppression is a morally bad thing. In other words, concept of morality. That if oppression is bad, there must be some understanding of bad is, and that could be a shared overlap with what a Christian worldview views as sin. Second possible overlap, it's not a complete overlap. It's just a significant, maybe, talking point. Versus God's good character. The second overlap, a lot of believers know that Nietzsche wasn't all wrong about And we realize that human beings have a very strong blind spots on our cultural power and our age power and English, and we just assume everybody should be speaking English and things like this, and that we should approach these conversations with great humility and with a teachable attitude. And to not do such is basically a kind of cultural pride and superiority that is off-putting. So we have some overlap there in terms of realizing that power can corrupt. And also, no group should insist that their lived experience exempts them from testing of their beliefs. Now, that would be a different one, because within critical theory, it does exempt them from critique, especially critique from people who aren't oppressed. In fact, according to critical theory, they're just having an issue of internal repression, which is not good. But so back to the positives. The third area of overlap is the whole issue of hegemonic power, that there can be systems, and we recognize systems of deceit. A small group of people that hold a lot of power. We might say that it's a small group, whether or not you become a department head, or even if you get tenure, or Hollywood or Madison Avenue, and its power to objectify women and seem to get by with it, and promote casual sex and endorse a view of human sexuality that deeply contradicts Scripture. And so we're aware of these things of group think in various areas of a strong controlling hegemony, and that it's part of the corruption of the fall. The individual humans, when they get together and create their group thinks, are prone to issues. So he goes on from here in page 11 to talk about race and racism, and he gives a history of racism to people because he believes that as Christians, of racism, because the United States has such a horrific history with racism. He traces it through slave trade, transatlantic thing, the 13th Amendment, Black Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King, and chattel slavery as just things that you should empathy with self-esteem, the history of access to educational achievement, vocational achievement, and inherited wealth and resources, and people in the teeth. So being able to appreciate the truths of critical theory may help illuminate truths about racial injustice, and a lot of times the church has not been so on top of this. They can be pretty monocultural, just like the neighborhood school. You've got the neighborhood church, and everybody who's in the same economic subculture of that particular neighborhood takes on those particular values and aren't very widely read about those, frankly, experiences. Then he gets into critiquing critical race theory on page 15 and 16, and where he questions the issue of epistemology, that only people without power can know things and other people cannot. And he points out that there's some circular reasoning in that that's similar to a full control conspiracy theory. He talks about issue of identity, and that we are created in the image of God. He talks about some of the implications for us in witness in terms of how we respond to critical race theory slogans, such as lived experience, or we should accept the claims of oppressed peoples, or we should never challenge someone's lived experience. I've heard Christians say this, in training and evangelism, they'll say, share your testimony. What's your testimony? What's your experience? People will never question your experience, because if they did that, they would be rude. So share lived experience. Tell your lived experience, and it's illegitimate to question that, because you're questioning a person's integrity and their story and their identity. But we need to be able to question that amongst ourselves and other people's story as well. He also talks about decolonializing our theology from European-centric Christianity, and that we do have our blind spots. But then he asks questions like, well, what about the Westminster Confession or the five solas of the Reformation? Do we need to get rid of these things and their biblical, their rootedness in biblical theology, because the source is Western European, or the source is the Reformation, or the source is Martin Luther in Germany, but it is helpful to have other voices talking to us. I've appreciated this living in Zambia and hearing from Zambian Christians issues about valuing family and other social structures that we tend to diminish in the West, or marginalize or put aside, like nursing homes and so forth. Finally, he says Christians are called to dismantle systems of oppression, but we need to understand what we mean by oppression and the definitions and what we're doing and why we are doing it. For instance, he makes a reference to adultism as a form of oppression of children, that we get 10 to 15 years of unpaid labor and brainwashing opportunities with our children. This is called adultism, an extreme form of critical theory that most Christians would have some issues with. Also, the oppose the heterosexual privilege and so forth. That helpful was the issue of truth and liberation. We do believe that Jesus is the truth, the ground of truth, and that he said, you will know the truth, and the truth has the power to set you free. There is morality, that injustice, properly understood, is immoral. There are 10 commandments, and when we don't live them out, it does oppress us and other people. One of the things I thought was particularly helpful was his section on justice and justification, which I hadn't really thought before. It says, just as Christianity teaches that all humans are stained by original sin, so contemporary critical theory teaches that all people, or at least almost all people, are stained by their membership in oppressor groups. But our Christianity has a view of and you can never do reparations enough. It works salvation and justification by living faith in Christ is a great liberation indeed. He talks about justification of the church, and he ends with that. But I wanted to give 2 pages of addendum to my own understanding of this booklet. One has to do with, well, I already said that one. That was on the 10 Commandments, that, that there is only one God. And when you don't believe in that God, you're worshiping idols, and that dehumanizes you. Lord's Day, or don't honor your parents. These things oppress you, and they oppress your family, and they harm society, and they add to lying, murder, hatred, adultery, coveting. These things are important. But the second part is, just as Shenvi says, you need to have a working understanding and empathy with America's history of race and racism. I think that's kind of the negative side. But it's also kind of a downer. I think I'm bringing back my screen now, or escaping that to bring us back to full screen here. And that is to share You can take a look at the whole Jew and Gentile issues of power in the book of Acts. Because the Jewish people that were bringing the relief were overlooking the Hellenistic Jews. And the sheets with the creepy crawlers before he would go to the Gentiles, and still he needed rebuked by Peter in Galatians. The early church did deal with issues of power. They couldn't even go into people's homes that were Gentile. When Peter was preaching, even before he got done with his message, empowering people that are outside of the in crowd of Judaism. But then you can go earlier in Acts to the life and ministry of Jesus Christ and his example as a first century Jewish male carpenter, and the way he related to women donors, the way he dealt with his mother, with Peter's mother-in-law, with the woman at the well in John 4, the only person he told directly, I am the Messiah and I'm speaking to you, empowered her to be an evangelist amongst the Samaritans, which were a marginalized people by the Jews, interracially married with half a Bible they only accepted the Pentateuch. Jesus was breaking up these power structures, and I think that a person steeped in critical theory would find these things very attractive and almost hard to believe if they weren't immune to the real thing. Unless you become as a child. Occupying army was not one size fits all. He said concerning the centurion, I've not seen faith like this guy has amongst all of my kinsmen according to the flesh, the Jewish people. And concerning the variably abled, with leprosy, even the dead, and empower them to raise them from the. I go too far on that. He even did so with oppressors like Matthew, who was in fact himself a tax collector in collusion with Rome. And he had a zealot as well that wanted to overthrow Rome. It was Simon, not Iscariot. But anyway, the point of my saying these things is Jesus is a person of grace, and he brings lasting change and is a of Boaz and Rahab and Ruth. Or you can look at the end of the Old Testament, closer to New Testament times, in the oppression of Jeremiah the prophet, when he's thrown down in the cistern. Who's the person that helps him out and extends justice to him? It's Ibn Malik, the Ethiopian eunuch. Just think about God, an Ethiopian. He's not Jewish. And Daniel witnesses to Nebuchadnezzar. Maybe Nebuchadnezzar, a pagan king, becomes a believer in the covenant God of covenant-making God Yahweh. Same with Cyrus, perhaps. So anyway, I just think approaching it in terms of a positive narrative can also be critical theory, or maybe have taken one class, but they don't know. And they're very steeped in it. I don't know. But news to offer. Sorry I went a little long there, Mark, but I give you an opportunity to do some pushback with me and question and answer. Did you catch how many minutes we went? Did we wait till 15 after? I don't know.
Oh, I don't know. But I appreciate the study there. And just on the last part, what struck me in listing the different stories around Jesus is just the variety of people that were there. And I think that's so relevant right now, as we know, Southern Baptist Convention now is wrestling with how to understand this topic and how to wrap their minds around it. And I wouldn't even take and cautionary. I think it's so complex that I would not take a statement from a pastor right now to be their final word on this topic. I mean, let's give them a little grace as they understand it. Now, when someone begins to, right, if they begin to double down, triple down on topics, okay, at that point, they're taking a position. But I still think it's early days. Let's show some grace to people, and especially if we have the opportunity to talk to leaders, and many of us know leaders that are pastors, teachers, college ministers. Let's deal with a little grace here as they navigate through this, because it's so complicated. And I don't think most of us did not see this in school, seminary, graduate school. And so what we're learning is really all new. And then, so that's one thought. I'll pause there. I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
I totally agree with you. I think if you burn the bridge prematurely, or you're in a rush to be Mr. Right, that you might actually galvanize somebody in a position that they're not really even ready to galvanize in yet, because they're just talking extemporarily about things that they've been exposed to, and maybe some of the sense of guilt in their own backgrounds of things that they or attitudes that they've held, and they're processing it. So we have to give people space to change and say, well, that's where they said they're at now, but I'm not sure they'll be there next week.
Right. But it even speaks to the stories you just listed. How many of the stories from Jesus' time where you saw within a period of months or years that people pivoted? And notably, the disciples at the time of his crucifixion, I mean, within months, they pivoted. And so, we don't know what the intentions are immediately. So we don't have to get overly anxious. Now, I realize as some of this is rolling out, some people will say, well, Mark, what about the response to George Floyd? All right, so I understand, in the cases where there's violence or that type of thing happening, sure, we have to respond in a way that's appropriate. But I think for most of us, we're not going to be dealing with a violent situation. We're going to be dealing with an academic discussion in the context of church policy, Lori Peters in the case of school boards. So although emotions might be heated, I mean, it is at a different level than when there's actual violence or crime involved.
I agree with you. Mm-hmm. How about that echoed on my end? That had extra power. And I agree with Mark.
and
Tabladillo, echo.
And here,
Go ahead,
so here's a third thought. I think when I was learning history back in the day, there has been a pivot, and that is that a lot of times history was first presented in the context of what would contemporaneously be seen as positive events. And then, to be accurate for example, in a college setting, then they would go into some of the negative aspects of whatever, the story was, not ignore them. Or in my case, I don't feel the history instruction I got was minimizing that, but it was overall taught in kind of a positive way. And maybe it did roll into this, idea of history as being a positive thing that's evolving forward. Maybe that kind of fed into it, but it almost seems like now.
Yeah. It didn't necessitate a violent revolution, which is pretty negative. Overwhelmingly.
Right.
But you're right. It was more positive.
It was more positive. And if I can imagine, how, for example, the American Revolution might be taught today, I think it might be presented in a very different way. So I think that part of this whole narrative is challenging us how someone might introduce a historical story. So again, I don't know if it's trendy or I don't know how to characterize that, but it's just an observation that, they're kind of capitalizing on the negative. And then I think finally too, another point is about policy. So I think ironically, although a lot of the concern from critical theory is people in power, it seems like an end game for many of them is policy. That's what they actually want. So yes, I mean, I've heard some people say reparations, but I don't see any serious proposals for that. It does seem like they have an idea of change policy in the sense of who should be in power, how should power even be distributed, how should decisions be made, and these are like all policy questions, and even in churches. So, while there might be some aspect of that, that might be fair to look at how are people in power exercising that. And such questions as, can you represent someone that's not in your demographic type of question? And obviously Jesus represented everybody in every demographic for every time setting, forever. So, I mean, a Christian worldview, we have a viewpoint that's possible.
But I think that's part of what I enjoyed about going back to the Testament is not saying that there is the sin nature, and it's always been there, and God's promises have always been there as well. And there's just seeing in the book of Acts, they're battling. And Jesus was way ahead of his time. He's timeless. And even some of the examples from the Old Testament. Looking healthy. Can you, Shenvi? We started at 9 o'clock. I'm glad you're able.
Yeah. How did I miss this?
I know. It was just.
I'm sorry that I missed it. It's like, oh my goodness, I just sat down and then this notification came across my computer. So I don't know how I missed this. I'm sorry.